first of the mega tsunamis of the past decade, even today, it's very rare, too rare, unfortunately. We don't really have any parallel studies from these depths. So we don't have anything to say, okay, well, here's a modern tsunami, and here's what it looks like. We're working on it. But hopefully some of you in a few years might come and study with me, send you off to Thailand. But you know, this is something that is currently being done. But it's not done as much as the terrestrial work, in which you can obviously, I'm sure you can think to yourself why that is. It's simply a bit more complicated to work underwater, and some people aren't typically doing it. And the other question is, how do you define tsunami deposit? I mean, this wasn't really clear. And this is a whole area of research that really the past decade has made leaps and bounds because of the recent large tsunamis, and we're starting to understand it. So first thing we need to do is let's get rid of the human influence. Let's make sure that this wasn't a mistake, that this wasn't a big, oops, we just dumped, the entire shipment of shell. Why did we do that big shell? We're not sure, but anyway, let's get rid of that possibility. Determine the lateral extent. So how wide, how far, how broad is this deposit? If this is a tsunami, tsunamis can affect one area more than another, but it's still a fairly broad area. They don't usually affect, one beach. They're going to affect, especially on an even coastline, you're going to expect to find it in a broad area, and not just near the harbor. We need to get away from this harbor that is a human problem. You also need to make sure you're not looking at just a big storm. You've got to differentiate. This is a big debate in tsunami studies, differentiating between storms and tsunamis. Make sure you're not looking at a big storm deposit. Now, this is the harbor today. This is an artificial part of the harbor that was added in the 1960s. And 2 years ago, there happened to be a sort of once-in-a-century storm. Very, very, very large storm. And as you can see, this is what the pier looked like afterwards. All of this rubble, this is actually the dive center that we work out of. You can see that it ripped up completely the tiles that were on the floor. If you were to look at this photograph, you're even a tsunami expert. I've shown this to some of my tsunami research friends and say, look at this. And they go, oh wow, what tsunami was that? So it wasn't a tsunami, this was a large storm. But for the sake of understanding this is not the coast. This is a pier. This is in the water. It's essentially, you can't compare it because but just to show you how powerful a big storm can be, you need to make sure that you're not looking at something that's caused by a big storm. And the major thing is recognizing between marine materials and terrestrial materials. Being able to see, finding those terrestrial materials in a marine context and then marine materials in a terrestrial context. That's how you're going to be able to recognize, one of the ways that we recognize a tsunami. And the big question is, where and how might we see the influence of a tsunami underwater? So these were the big questions. Now, a little bit of review. I know that you've all heard of tsunamis. Unfortunately, it's been, we've seen what it can do the last couple of years. But to understand some of the dynamics of it, in a normal wave, in a storm wave or just regular weather-driven waves, you have the wave and it affects the bottom. Okay? And that's what we call that influence on the bottom. In general, in terms of the dynamics, it's about half of the wavelength. Okay, the wavelength is from here to here, and the depth to which it can influence is about half of the wavelength. Now, a tsunami, by definition, has a very, very long wavelength. Okay, because what causes the tsunami is the displacement of water. It's not coming from winds at the surface. So when you have a tsunami, it has a very, very long wavelength, and it also has a very, very deep influence. So this is a useful piece of information because, in theory, we should be able to see that influence of a tsunami in much deeper water than we see storm influence because of that dynamic. So one things we looked at were foraminifera. Now these are tiny little microscopic critters. When you go to any beach, when you're in any sea, the sand that you're looking at is made up, a certain percentage of it is going to look like this if you go to a microscope. Okay? The sand is actually made out of, some of it, like, especially if you go to somewhere like in the Gulf of Mexico, where you have those beautiful white beaches, well, this is one of the culprits, okay, are the foraminifera. Those of you who remember the days of chalk and blackboards, chalk is made out of foraminifera. So it is incredibly, incredibly common. They're worldwide, and in this case, they're very useful because there's a specific group of foraminifera that lived in the ancient harbor. Okay, because these critters are very, very sensitive to their environment, and when they build the harbor, they change the environment. It goes from being an open marine system, an open, high energy system, to a quiet water system. That's the idea of a harbor, right? That's why you build a harbor, so that you calm water for the ships. Well, that calm water changes the environment for all of the critters that live inside it, including the foraminifera. So the foraminifera then, and you end up seeing certain species proliferate and become more common because of that changed environment. So one of the things I wanted to see is maybe way offshore we might find some of these harbor foraminifera. I also went through all the publications of the time that existed to see how have people described the tsunami deposit. What are the characteristics of the tsunami deposit? You don't need to, we're not going to go through this whole list, but basically, different characteristics. You saw those shells, the way the shells were one on top of the other. When you have tilted marine installations, all of these different things have been used to describe the tsunami deposit. So the first time we went out to try to resolve this whole tsunami issue, this time we went with the big guns and brought this beautiful research ship that's from a not-for-profit called Echo Ocean. And we went out and decided to take cores, to go into deeper water away from the harbor, and to basically insert these pipes, remove them with the sediment inside, and then take a look at the layers and see whether or not we can recognize the sediments. Our first campaign, we had big ambitions. We were going to collect a line this way and a line that way, and we're going to have 12 cores, and everything's going to be great. Well, we got 2, and we were very pleased. We did a lot of tinkering and a lot of changes, but ultimately we found 2. First sketches that came up, sure enough, we're seeing these layers that we'd seen before, but actually we're seeing 2 layers, you may notice. But we seem to be seeing this layering happening. Looked for the foraminifera, and boom, boom, the species that were specific to the harbor are more common in those horizons. And oops, this I'm gonna buzz through a little bit, but I decided to apply, again, talk about scientific accidents. After collecting the cores, we had a group of researchers. We decided, okay, you're gonna do this, and you're gonna do this. Well, so-and-so got greedy and decided they were going to do that analysis, and I thought, oh no, what am I going to do? That was what I was planning to do. Well, now I'm really in trouble, because I was really interested in this foraminifera question. But the foraminifera question, they decided to deal with it, so okay, gotta think of something else. I don't have anything else. I don't know what else to do with it. So there was this machine that measures grain size, and I thought, well, I guess I'll do that. How boring. So I ran the analysis on the grain size, and what it does is it measures. Now, this is where, when you see the results, you see what's very exciting, but the lab work is definitely quite tedious. But basically, every centimeter you take a sample, you run it through this machine, and the machine gives you the proportion of the size of the sand going up to 2 millimeters. Okay, so it's dividing up sizes up to 2 millimeters into 92 different size groups. Everyone awake still? Okay. But what is really exciting about it, so this is the different sizes of the grain sizes going down to core. And then, because I didn't want to stop there, I took each of these analyses and put them through what's called contour mapping, which shows me the distribution of the sizes. And so this is like if you're looking at each of the cores. This is a core from 15 meters, and this is a core from 20 meters. And this is, each line is one set of this analysis. So, not surprisingly, where we have those layers, we get these kind of big jumps, okay, in the grain size. And in 15 meters, we have 1, 2, maybe 3, something like that, okay? And in between, we have these smaller little bumps. In the 20 meter, you can see we've got definitely 1, or maybe it's 1 unit of this, larger spread of the grain size, and maybe a couple other here. Now remember what I said storms and tsunamis. So this was very, very exciting because you want to be able to differentiate between storms and tsunamis. So, and in shallower, you're going to have storm influence. In deeper, you're not. In shallow, you're going to have storm, and you're also going to have tsunami influence. In deep, you're only going to have tsunamis. Everyone still with me? So the theory here was maybe what we're seeing, these are our large storms, the smaller ones, and the bigger ones are tsunami events. So now we have a way to say we have storms, this is what a storm looks like, and this is what a tsunami looks like. And in the deep, of course, this would mean maybe this is a capital double T tsunami, maybe this is a little t tsunami, but perhaps we're only seeing tsunamis, and these smaller blurbs are actually corresponding with the tsunami events. So dates are good for figuring that out. And I thought that this lower layer was going to give me, actually this layer, was going to give me maybe that 2,000-year-old event, the 115. Sent in the date came back, and the date was 1660 BC, so 3,500 years ago, 1660 to 1460 BC, so way off, way off. I was very, very disappointed. And I thought, oh crap, bad date. Okay, well let's send in some more dates, let's get some more numbers. So from over here, I sent what I correlated as the same layer, and I got the same date. Again, and I sent in another sample. I got the same date. I kept getting the same bad date. Well, 1490 to 1680 BC. Does anyone know of any events in the Mediterranean that happened around then? Say 1500 BC. There was a big eruption. Okay? The Santorini eruption. So around 1500 BC, you have this massive, one of the largest eruptions in sort of recent history, and corresponds with this date. And it was related, it was associated with tsunamis. So it looks like we actually, not only did we recognize the tsunami, we recognized another tsunami. So it turns out that the Santorini eruption actually reached all the way to the furthest parts of the eastern Mediterranean. So we have this evidence for the Santorini tsunami. So encouraged by that, we went back out, did some more work. Here we are excavating. This is how you work underwater. It's an underwater vacuum cleaner. And we needed to re-excavate those original shell deposits because we'd run out of sample. And I also wanted to look at it again because now, comparing it with this grocery list, let's see what else we can find. One of the things that we found, which was really fascinating, was that when we worked in the harbor, I mentioned that harbors, it changes the environment. It's a calm water environment. If you've ever gone swimming in a lake, okay, you don't want to touch the bottom. It's kind of gross. When I was a kid, I was always freaked out by it. I grew up in the lakes region up near in Fort Wisconsin, so we would always go in the lakes. I liked to swim, but I hated touching the bottom because it was just awful. It's this, really, really slimy, nasty stuff. Well, that's because it's basically a calm, quiet area, and all the fine stuff goes to the bottom. Same thing in a harbor. A harbor, a well-kept harbor, is going to have this mucky, muddy, junky bottom. So, but what was really strange is when we would excavate in the harbor, we'd excavate, everything was good, find this, find that. And the harbor floor we could recognize because of these harbor muds. But every once in a while, the harbor floor would go away. You'd be working and there'd be a chunk missing. And then you'd excavate and there'd be these random missing pieces. And we had the explanation was, oh, they're anchor poles. That maybe these are places where anchors were put in, and then when they would leave, they'd pull up the anchor, and you'd end up with these, missing chunks. Well, that might be true. However, some of them ended up way outside the harbor, because during these excavations, we found ripclasts, which is the term for those packs of mud. And then when we analyzed it, we had the same foraminifera that we find in the harbor. So again, and this is one of the pieces of evidence that's used for tsunami is actually this ripclast, the movement of these muddy pieces. So the second time we went out, we were much more successful. 6 cores, 8 working days. And we found in most of the cores, we're seeing these same horizons, and give you some close-up of what this looks like. Like even in the cores, you see how these shells are nice and lined up? Okay, it's called imbricated, just like we saw in the big deposit. We actually could see that in the cores, for some of the cores from 10, 15 meters water depth. Here we got very lucky. Here's a ceramic piece that popped up in the